Welcome back. This is Chapter 4 in your textbook, and we're going to talk about theoretical frameworks for research. Hopefully, by the end of this chapter, you're going to be able to describe the relationship among theory, research, and practice, identify the purpose of conceptual and theoretical frameworks for nursing research, differentiate between conceptual and operational definitions, identify different types of theories used in nursing research, describe how theory or conceptual framework guides research, and explain the points of critical appraisal. Of course, to be able to accomplish all of these learning outcomes, you need to first read the chapter, and if you haven't done so, you should really do that first. As I will always say, it's better to read the chapter first, then listen to the lecture. And if after listening to the lecture you have questions, then you can refer back to the chapter. And generally, as a rule, it will make more sense then. When we think of theoretical frameworks, when we think of theoretical frameworks in research, one of the things that you want to think about is what are all the pieces that work together in our practice? And we need to be able to combine practice, research, and theory. They are all one of the big picture for us. In your textbook, there was a case study, and the case study walks you through how you make these fit together. For me, it was slightly a different approach that made all of these fit together, because what I do is not necessarily typical nursing research, but more research related to disasters and public health emergencies. For me, my practice is the care of people that have been impacted for a disaster. And the research then generally occurs following a disaster or is related to preparedness for a disaster. In this case, typical nursing theory doesn't always work, although there are some nursing theories that would work quite well. In one study I did, I used a combination of nursing crisis theory and Hayden's matrix. And when combined into one thing, they then met my needs at looking at radiation disasters. But for each of you, this may be different depending on your focus. Let's start out with what a theory is. A theory is a set of interrelated concepts that provide a systematic view of a phenomenon. That's the definition your book has. One that I prefer comes from Kurlinger, which you have heard me mention before. And Kurlinger said, a theory is a set of interrelated constructs or concepts, definitions, and propositions that present a systematic view of phenomenon by specifying relations among variables with the purpose of explaining and predicting the phenomenon. Now, that is long and might be a little hard for some people to grasp without picturing it. So I'll try to picture it for you later. But for right now, think of it this way. Relationships can be proposed, and then predictions can be made. And after you can make the predictions, you can take action, or you can suggest action to improve, in our case frequently, the outcomes of the care we provide. It gives the researcher a logical way to collect and explain data. As a young nurse, one of my favorite nursing theories was Orum's self-care deficit theory. And I liked it because it allowed me to arrange everything in my head so that it was easily retrievable for me. I knew that reading her theory, the nurse was supposed to provide the care for the patient that the patient wasn't able to do themselves. We did for them the things they could not do on their own. And to me, that worked. It was logical. I could understand it. It helped me to store so many nursing facts in a way that I could retrieve them. Your practice as a nurse is based on theories that have been tested and validated through research, which in turn impacts your practice. And even if you don't know you're using a theory, that means you are practicing based on the theory that somebody else used and that they tested. So it's important to remember that practice, research, and theory all work together. You don't really have one without the other. Now let's break down theory a little bit and see if we can make it a little more logical to us. Theory is logically composed of concepts. And remember, concepts and constructs are often terms that are used interchangeably. They're a little different, but for our purposes, let's use them as one thing. You can call them constructs or you can call them concepts. I tend to refer to them as concepts. So theory is logically composed of concepts, definitions, assumptions, and generalizations. The major function of the theory is to describe and explain. In fact, theory is a good general explanation, which often leads to basic principles. Theory is always heuristic because it stimulates and guides further development of knowledge. If you want to read more about this in an easy-to-understand page, I have provided the link for you. The importance here is that we use theories to guide our actions. One component of a theory, then, is a concept. And remember I said we can use the word theory and concept and construct interchangeably. And while your book gives slightly different definitions, it refers to a concept as an image or symbolic representation of an abstract idea, the key identified element of a phenomenon that is necessary to understand. And it says they can be concrete or abstract, whereas it defines a construct as complex concepts. Constructs usually comprise more than one concept and are built or constructed to fit the purpose. And their examples are health promotion, maternal-infant bonding, and so forth. So in this definition, yes, there is a slight difference, but for most people, they pretty much use them interchangeably. Another way to think of this is in terms that have been given an abstract, generalizable meaning, such as culture, or, for me, preparedness, or even health. Conceptual frameworks and theoretical frameworks are not quite the same thing, but for our purposes, we're going to talk about them together. It is a set of interrelated concepts that represents an image or a phenomenon. It is the structure that provides guidance for research and practice. So it identifies the key concepts and describes the relationships to each other and the phenomenon or the variables of concern. In many ways, think of this as the picture which makes something clear to you. our minds have the ability to look at words, and it takes us longer to interpret the words often than it does a picture. So think of your conceptual or theoretical framework as your picture that becomes your guide. This is kind of the framework that I'm currently using for my research, and I'm showing this to you because in many ways it's easier for me to understand because it's something I'm familiar with. At the center of my human-centered structured analytic approach, which was a combination of an analytic approach I'd used previously for research and human-centered design, the end user is at the center. And the question then is, who is the end user? Well, it depends on what you're doing, what you're studying. In this case, I was looking at scope of practice for nurse practitioners. So the end user would be the nurse practitioners. We always started out this by trying to use an ethnographic approach because we wanted to understand the population we were working with. We then wanted to assess all local, state, and federal regulations, and then identify the scope of practice by states and territories. We called this exploring, so it was the first phase. The second phase was to ascertain. And you can see the different areas of this we worked through. And all of these areas of discussions and document reviews and surveys and expert interviews formed our evidence base to come to our brainstorming session. And I think here is where we have some of the concepts we used. For example, self-determination, which is to say that individuals know better for themselves what they need than we as the providers know for them. Another one was self-sufficiency, which basically means you want to return people to the point that they are able to take care of their needs without your assistance. And of course, there are others. We would then come up with prototypes and have success stories, workshops, and toolkits to verify what we'd find. And then we would test and refine these and start all over again if necessary. Everybody has a model that they use in their research. So for me, in the research I'm currently doing, this is my model. At other times, it has been other models that fit the specific research design. So you do not have to stick with one. And as I said before, when I did research on radiation and nursing, we in fact used two. We used the crisis theory of nursing, and we added with it Hayden's matrix, which is a good way to look at accidents. And we combined the two together because they provided us the entire framework that we needed. You need to always make sure you operationalize your definitions. So operational definitions define what instruments will be used to assess the presence of the concept and will be used to describe the amount or degree of which the concept exists. So the operational definition then is absolutely necessary before you think you're going to start measuring things. And as I said, often we need more than one theory. And one way to look at this is to look at all the different levels and types of nursing theory. And this table that's in your book, table 4.3, is just a few examples of the types of theories and the many theories that exist. From the grand theories, which tend to be very big and very broad, and in my opinion, much harder to operationalize. Florence Nightingale's Notes on Nursing, and you will notice in this list is the self-care deficit nursing theory, which was the one that I used for my master's thesis. And then there are middle range theories, and many people, most nurses at some point, study the health promotion model by Pender. And it is still very commonly used in nursing. And then finally, there are situation-specific theories. Theory of peaceful end of life, theory of chronic sorrow, and so forth. It depends on what you need, and sometimes you will need more than one of these. Some important things for you to consider. When you're looking at a research article, that research article will frequently have a framework. It is not always easy to identify what framework authors use, largely because peer-reviewed publications tend to be page limited, and if people can leave out one thing versus their findings, they will choose to leave out the theoretical framework or the conceptual framework that they used, and they will skip it. But if they didn't, and you're critically evaluating an article, you want to ask yourself these questions. Is the framework for research clearly identified? And hopefully it will be. Is the framework consistent with the nursing perspective? Now, of course, this only applies to nursing research. And over time, nursing has gotten more and more flexible about what we consider the nursing perspective and what we accept and what we don't accept. So there was a day when using the human-centered analytic approach would not be acceptable in nursing. And now most people would never question that. Are the concepts and the variables clearly and appropriately defined? And you should be able, in any research article you read, to pick out the variables. And you should be able to tell what they are, because without telling what they are, then it would be hard to tell how they were being measured. Was sufficient literature presented to support the study of the selected concepts? Now, what is sufficient? And that is always a hard question to answer. But it's one of those things that when you get used to reading articles, you're going to know it when you see it. If somebody cites only one source to support what they're presenting, that would probably not be considered sufficient. You need to look and see if they covered the concept and if they adequately addressed it. And you get to the point you can do that by reading a lot of articles. It gives you an idea of what normal and what acceptable is. I will take this back to you. It's like doing a physical exam. When you first start doing them, you don't know what a normal lung sound is. When you've listened to 1,000 lungs, you know what normal is and you know what abnormal is. The same will be the case with reviewing literature. When you do one, you probably won't be able to tell. When you do 50, you'll be picking it up. By the time you've done 100, you will wonder why you ever thought it was hard. Is there a logical, consistent link between the framework, the concepts being studied, and the methods of measurement? The last thing you want to see in a study is a conceptual framework and concepts, and you're wondering, why in the world is this what they're measuring? Because it doesn't answer the question. And finally, are the study findings examined in relationship to the framework? And if an author tells you what their framework is, then they should refer their findings back to their framework and tell you how they match up. I think that this gives you a fairly broad and quick overview of your chapter. Again, go through and read it again. And remember that when you are working on your discussions and when you're working on your paper, You want to try to apply what you've read in the chapter. Finally, as you all know, I have office hours every week. They're open via Zoom, and you can join me and ask any questions you have then. Thank you.